Are foods with anti-nutrients bad for you? In today's video, we're going to discuss anti-nutrients. We're going to begin by discussing what are anti-nutrients. We're going to discuss several different types of anti-nutrients, as well as foods that contain anti-nutrients. Next, we're going to discuss the effects of anti-nutrients. You would assume that by the name anti-nutrients that these are all bad effects, but that's not actually the case. There are good effects of anti-nutrients as well. So we want to weigh the good with the bad to determine if this is something we really need to concern ourselves with. Moving along, we're going to discuss what does the human data show on people who consume foods that contain anti-nutrients. We're also going to use a pretty interesting example, coffee, one that a lot of people like, as to why you really shouldn't just rely on mechanistic data to determine whether or not you should eat things. And finally, we're going to end by discussing the best practices surrounding consuming foods that contain anti-nutrients. What should you do and when should you really be concerned about them? Before we dive into the presentation, I want to give a shout out to a paper that was recently published called Anti-Nutrients, Lectins, Goitrogens, Phytates, and Oxalates, Friends or Foe, which is written by Lopez Moreno, Garces Ramon, and Miguel. Great paper, great overview. Recommend you check it out. There will be a link in the description below. What are anti-nutrients? Anti-nutrients are components of plant-based foods. Many people refer to them as plant-based toxins, but that's only if you look at the one side of the coin of anti-nutrients. So the primary negative effect of anti-nutrients is that they inhibit the absorption of some nutrients, primarily minerals, and they can also have negative effects on the gut environment. So we want to kind of look at what it's all doing. However, when we look at this kind of blocking the absorption of minerals, this may not actually be a bad thing. This may help kind of save minerals for the microbiome because the members of the microbiome are dependent on minerals as well for their metabolic processes. Anti-nutrients are reduced by various preparation strategies. We'll also discuss that. And we're also going to talk about the beneficial effects of anti-nutrients. So the name anti-nutrients is really a misnomer. Anti-nutrients kind of gives you the assumption that these are a one-sided molecule, that they only cause bad effects, but that is actually not the case. And we have several pieces of evidence that indicate that there are beneficial effects to anti-nutrients. The first anti-nutrient we're going to discuss are lectins. You've probably heard of lectins before. There's a book about it. Lectins are primarily found in nuts, cereal grains, and legumes. When you cook, boil, germinate, or ferment these foods, this causes a dramatic reduction in lectins. And as far as the potential negative effects of lectins, they may potentially increase intestinal permeability and activation of the immune system. They may decrease the absorption of minerals, and they may have a hemagglutinating activity, which means they basically can cause red blood cells to clump together, potentially. The potential beneficial effects of lectins are that they are anti-angiogenic and anti-metastatic, meaning that they are anti-cancer, and anti-proliferative, meaning that they would decrease the proliferation of cancer, anti-tumoral. They have an anti-diabetic effect. They can modulate the immune system, and they have an antimicrobial effect as well. So as you can see, as even in the starting out in the first type of anti-nutrient, we really have good and bad that we're looking at here, not just bad. Our next anti-nutrient are phytates. Phytates are found in nuts, seeds, legumes, and whole grains. You can reduce the content of these foods by soaking, germinating, fermenting, and cooking them. An important thing to point out, phytates, when you consume them more and more over a long period of time, lead to changes in the microbiome that increase your ability to kind of degrade phytates. So we'll discuss what that means in a little bit. So the potential negative effects of phytates is that they reduce the bioavailability of minerals. So they bind to minerals and reduce the bioavailability to them. Jumping back to the changes in the microbiome, those changes, long-term changes in the microbiome that happen with increased consumption actually make these minerals more bioavailable because they break the binding of phytate to these minerals. The potential beneficial effects of phytates include antioxidant properties. They lower cholesterol, improve diabetes, neuroprotective, meaning they protect neurons, and they can prevent against cancer, and they may improve bone density. Now, another interesting thing that was recently found is that the changes to the microbiome induced by phytate consumption may improve gut homeostasis by changing genetic expression in the gut. So I won't bore you with the specifics of that, but it's just really important to point out that there are both beneficial and negative effects to phytates, and even further to point out that in a lot of these mechanistic studies finding beneficial effects of anti-nutrients, we're really not looking at human data. When we look at phytates, we do have human data showing the antioxidant, anti-diabetic, and the anti-osteoporotic effect of phytates. Glucosinolates are an anti-nutrient found in cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, etc. They are reduced by freezing, boiling, and other cooking methods. Just to point out, as we talk about the beneficial effects, these effects are dependent on the microbiome. Regularly consuming foods with glucosinolates will change your microbiome in a way that will allow you to access these beneficial effects. The potential negative effects of glucosinolates is that they may disrupt thyroid function, and the potential beneficial effects are that they are anti-cancer. In other words, they're anti-proliferative and chemopreventative. They can lower cholesterol. They have an anti-inflammatory effect, and they may also benefit asthma. They may reduce asthma effects. And again, we have human data showing these beneficial effects. Oxalates are another anti-nutrient. They are found primarily in leafy greens, nuts, legumes, and some other foods such as beets and other tubers. They are reduced by boiling, steaming, soaking, and fermenting. However, it's important to point out that there are dozens of bacteria in the human microbiome that can degrade oxalates. Kind of this theory that oxalates are a problem was kind of brought up when we thought that there was only one microbe that can break down oxalates. However, there are dozens of bacteria in the human microbiome that can degrade oxalate, and the potential negative effect is the increased kidney stone disease risk. However, it seems that the calcium intake is more of a driver here. Oxalate will bind calcium in the gastrointestinal tract, so if you're consuming enough calcium, you won't absorb oxalate, and it shouldn't really cause a problem. If you look at all the data, the human data as well as most of the animal models, the way that they induce a problem with oxalates is by feeding the animals or humans a low oxalate diet. So crib notes from this: simply just consume adequate calcium in your diet. There really are no beneficial effects to oxalates, so if you do decide to remove them, you're really not having a negative effect by removing the oxalates per se. The negative effect from removing the oxalates is that you are removing otherwise healthy foods that have other beneficial compounds in them. Finally, saponins are another form of anti-nutrient found in legumes, grains, and tubers. Again, soak them, cook them, will improve, reduce the saponin content. The negative effects of saponins are that they can bind iron, reduce fat-soluble vitamin absorption, or disrupt the intestinal barrier. However, the beneficial effects are that they can lower cholesterol, they can improve blood glucose regulation, improve bone health, and lower cancer risk. These are human studies as well, so we're not just really focusing on mechanistic or in vitro studies here. Now this brings us to an important question. Are foods that contain anti-nutrients good or bad? The answer to that is it's complicated, although not really at all. We don't really want to focus on single nutrients within foods. We want to see what the global effect of the consumption of food does, because all foods have beneficial and negative effects to them. So let's jump into that. What does the human outcome data show in people who consume foods with these anti-nutrients? For one, better health with these foods, a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes. And these are things that most people will experience in their life and lead to a lot of morbidity and mortality. Next, reduced all-cause mortality with people who consume higher amounts of these foods. And interestingly, we find that swapping out animal-based proteins for plant-based proteins will lead to lower all-cause mortality. And the interesting thing here is that plant-based proteins generally have most of these anti-nutrients, as well as other anti-nutrients that we haven't discussed as well. So the important take home for this is that we really want to look at what happens in humans. The human outcome data is more important than the mechanistic studies, especially when we showed you from the previous slides that these foods have both positive mechanistic benefits and negative mechanistic benefits. So all foods are like this. No food is strictly good or strictly bad. So what happens when humans consume these foods? Generally speaking, we get better outcomes. Now, a lot of people will say you can't really rely on observational or epidemiological data, because there are flaws in it, but there are more flaws and just completely ignoring the epidemiology and going right to mechanistic studies, because we have mechanistic studies showing positive and negative effects. Generally speaking, a recent review on the topic looked at how observational studies look in predicting randomized clinical trial outcomes, meaning actual experiments where we're giving people things. And generally speaking, the observational studies fall right in line with what we find in the randomized clinical trials. And we actually have an interesting example of this next, looking at coffee. So what happens when we consume coffee, and how does that relate to DNA damage? This is a question that we can actually look at in the same way as people look at anti-nutrients. So when we look at coffee, coffee contains acrylamides. Acrylamides damage DNA. So we're looking at a mechanistic study showing that coffee contains acrylamides, and this is going to damage your DNA, which could lead to cancer. So based on this mechanistic speculation, we should avoid coffee altogether. However, when we look at coffee as a whole, it also contains antioxidants, and antioxidants can help prevent DNA damage and even potentially help repair DNA. There are other beneficial molecules as well. What do the observational studies show? An observational meta-analysis, meaning looking at all of the observational studies, finds that coffee protects against many types of cancer. Fortunately, this is a situation where we do not have to rely on the observational data. We actually do have a human randomized clinical trial we can look at. So let's do that. Consumption of a dark roast coffee blend reduces DNA damage in humans. Results from a 4-week randomized controlled study. What they did here was they fed 100 volunteers water for 4 weeks, and then they fed them coffee for 4 weeks. And what did they find? A 23% reduction in DNA damage when these people consumed coffee. So here we can see, you would think based on a single mechanistic study that coffee would cause DNA damage because it contains acrylamides. However, when you look at a randomized clinical trial, you find that it actually reduces DNA damage. That's because coffee has multiple molecules in it that may induce DNA damage or repair DNA damage. And so when we look at the consumption, we find that it reduces DNA damage. So the important take home from here is, if you're looking to reduce DNA damage, consume coffee, and don't just rely on what a mechanistic study shows, because it's very myopic. It's only looking at one attribute of coffee when we want to look at the whole food. So what does this story tell us about the best practices to approach anti-nutrients? Well, first off, properly prepare foods with anti-nutrients in them. That will make the nutrients that they generally kind of block absorption of more bioavailable. Soak them, sprout them, ferment them, and cook them. This will allow you to get a small amount of these quote-unquote anti-nutrients that actually may be beneficial, while also allowing yourself to better absorb the other components within the food. Stick to whole, lightly processed foods. This can produce an entourage effect. What do we mean by entourage effect? There are components within a food matrix, in other words, an entire food, that may cause problems, whereas other ones may either remedy the problems or lead to beneficial effects. A great example of this is phytates. Phytates, when consumed on their own, may be problematic, but when consumed with fiber, there's no problem with them. Increasing fiber increases acidity within the gastrointestinal tract, and that prevents the binding of fiber to other minerals and such. So if we're properly preparing them and we're consuming them in whole food, we're dealing with less problems. Avoid things like nut butters and flour, which may concentrate anti-nutrients in your diet. You're getting this huge bolus dose of anti-nutrients, which may be very bad. You don't want to kind of overdo these things. There are beneficial and negative effects, but we don't want to kind of test the waters by just over consuming these things. Also, ultra-processed foods are things you want to kind of limit because they may also concentrate anti-nutrients. And a lot of the times, ultra-processed foods remove things like fiber that are providing beneficial effects. So we just focus on whole unprocessed foods, and anti-nutrients are probably not going to be a big concern for you. If you do have issues, say gut issues, mineral deficiencies, or what have you, consider removal followed by reintroduction to see if you can repair the issue. So if you have issues with, say, digestion, absorption, and maybe quote-unquote leaky gut, you may want to remove lectins. If you have mineral deficiencies, you may want to remove phytates for a while and then slowly reintroduce them to build up the microbiome that can break them from your minerals, things like that. And finally, focus on diet diversity. Don't focus on just consuming a ton of one single food. This can lead to problems. Eat many different foods with many different effects to help create a diet that's personalized to you and that both fits your lifestyle as well as your what you hope to achieve in terms of health outcomes. Thank you very much for listening in to this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got benefit out of it. If you did like it and you feel that it's worthwhile information and you want to receive more videos like this, please hit the subscribe button. If you think it was great and it could help other people, please like and share on social media. As always, if you have questions, comments, constructive criticisms, put them in the comments section below. Take care.